Sometimes the dead speak louder than the living. I'm Miss Marple. Welcome to my new case.
It was the sort of afternoon that made even the most pessimistic villager believe in the essential goodness of English country life. The autumn garden party at Richwood Manor had drawn the better part of St. Mary Mead to its manicured lawns, where the late Mr. Bellingham's prize roses still bloomed with defiant splendor despite the October chill. Miss Jane Marple sat beneath the spreading branches of an ancient oak, her knitting needles moving with their customary precision, while her mild blue eyes took in the familiar tableau of village society at play. The new master of Richwood Manor, Mr. Giles Whitworth, moved among his guests with the calculated bonhomie of a man still learning his role as country squire. He had purchased the estate 6 months prior, much to the surprise of locals who had expected it to remain shuttered after old Mr. Bellingham's passing. Whitworth was a London man, made wealthy through some business venture that no one quite understood, but everyone pretended to approve of. His fiancée, Miss Clarissa Vale, possessed the sort of brittle elegance that made the village ladies adjust their own hats self-consciously. Mrs. Pym, Whitworth's recently appointed housekeeper, bustled between the refreshment tables with officious efficiency. She had replaced the beloved Mrs. Bellingham's longtime staff with newcomers of her own choosing, a decision that had caused considerable gossip in the village. Dr. Ashe, the local physician, stood near the croquet lawn looking distracted, his attention divided between polite conversation and what Miss Marple suspected were pressing concerns about unpaid bills. Young Hugh Davenport, the estate manager, watched Miss Vale with poorly concealed admiration while attempting to explain crop rotation to the vicar's wife. The handbell ringers from St. Mary Mead had been invited to perform, their polished brass instruments gleaming in the afternoon sun. Miss Marple noted with interest how the newest member of the group, a sharp-faced woman named Mrs. Crawford, kept glancing toward the manor house with an expression of barely suppressed resentment. There had been some unpleasantness, she recalled, about the Church Restoration Fund and Mr. Whitworth's reluctance to contribute as generously as his predecessor. As the afternoon progressed, a bank of grey clouds gathered on the horizon, promising rain before evening. The first drops began to fall just as Mr. Whitworth excused himself from a conversation about the local hunt, claiming he needed to fetch some papers from his study. Miss Marple observed that Miss Vale's smile grew somewhat strained as she watched him go, and that Mr. Davenport's gaze lingered on the young woman's face with obvious concern. The shower, when it came, was sudden and decisive. Guests hurried toward the shelter of the manor's covered terrace, their laughter mixing with the sound of raindrops on gravel. Mrs. Pym directed the handbell ringers to the music room, where they could wait, out the weather, in comfort. The brass bells caught the lamplight as they were carefully arranged on the piano, their surfaces reflecting the cozy glow of the room. It was then that Kitty, the young parlour-maid, appeared in the doorway with a tea service for her master. Mrs. Pym had been quite specific about Mr. Whitworth's preferences: strong tea with 1 sugar, served in the study where he would not be disturbed. Miss Marple noticed, without appearing to do so, that one of the cups on the tray bore a faint trace of lipstick, and that the silver spoon was of a different pattern than the others, older, more tarnished. The minutes passed with the comfortable murmur of enforced sociability. Someone remarked on the excellent quality of the seed cake, another praised the arrangement of the dahlias. It was Mrs. Pym who first noticed the absence of their host, her voice carrying a note of irritation as she wondered aloud where Mr. Whitworth had gotten to. Miss Vale suggested, with brittle humour, that he was probably counting the raindrops, but her jest fell flat in the suddenly attentive silence. Mr. Davenport volunteered to fetch him, but before he could move, Kitty reappeared in the music-room doorway. Her face had gone the colour of old parchment, and her hands trembled as she gripped the doorframe. "Please, ma'am," she whispered to Mrs. Pym. He's not—" The discovery that followed would shatter the peaceful afternoon forever. Mr. Giles Whitworth sat slumped in his leather chair, the teacup overturned on his desk blotter, his face bearing the serene expression of a man who had simply dozed off. But Dr. Ashe's grim pronouncement confirmed what the absolute stillness of the figure had already suggested. Most curious of all, as Mr. Davenport would later observe, was that no one had heard anything at all. Dr. Ashe withdrew his hand from Mr. Whitworth's wrist with the deliberate care of a man who had delivered such news too many times before. The pronouncement, when it came, fell upon the assembled guests with the weight of absolute finality. "I'm afraid there's nothing to be done," he said quietly, his earlier distraction replaced by professional gravity. "Mr. Whitworth has passed away." The silence that followed was broken only by Miss Vale's sharp intake of breath and the soft patter of rain against the study windows. Mrs. Pym moved with characteristic efficiency, drawing the curtains closed and adjusting the desk lamp as though proper lighting might restore some semblance of order to the chaos that had descended upon her well-managed household. Kitty, the parlour maid who had made the discovery, stood trembling in the doorway until Mrs. Pym guided her to a chair with surprising gentleness. "Heart failure, most likely," Dr. Ashe announced to the small crowd that had gathered in the hallway. Miss Marple, observing from her position near the music room, noted the slight hesitation in his voice and the way his eyes lingered on the overturned teacup. The strain of recent months, the estate purchase, wedding preparations, these things take their toll on a man. Inspector Slack arrived within the hour, his motor car crunching up the gravel drive with an authority that seemed to restore some natural order to the afternoon's events. He was a methodical man who took his duties seriously, though Miss Marple suspected his experience with sudden death in country houses was somewhat limited. He examined the study with painstaking care, noting the scattered papers, the peaceful expression on the deceased man's face, and most particularly, the china and silver scattered across the desk blotter. The guests were asked to remain while preliminary statements were taken. Young Hugh Davenport proved unexpectedly helpful in these arrangements, demonstrating a knowledge of estate matters that impressed even Mrs. Pym. He contacted Mr. Whitworth's London solicitor and gently suggested that the remaining party guests might wish to return to their homes once the inspector had finished with them. Miss Marple observed with interest how naturally he assumed these responsibilities and how Miss Vale seemed to defer to his judgment despite her obvious distress. "Such a shock," Mrs. Crawford murmured to anyone who would listen, her sharp features animated by the drama. "Though I can't say I'm entirely surprised. The man had a look about him. Too much rich living, too much worry about money matters." She lingered near the study door, her eyes taking in every detail with what might have been professional curiosity or something less charitable. Miss Marple's knitting needles maintained their steady rhythm as she listened to the theories beginning to form among the witnesses. The handbell ringers whispered among themselves about the deceased man's pallor at the morning service. Mrs. Pym lamented the disruption to her household routine while simultaneously asserting her authority over the remaining staff. Miss Vale sat in composed silence, her gloved hands folded in her lap, though Miss Marple noted how tightly the kid leather stretched across her knuckles. It was during these preliminary conversations that certain details began to emerge. Kitty, still pale but eager to be helpful, explained to Inspector Slack that Mr. Whitworth had been particular about his afternoon tea ritual. Always served at precisely 4 o'clock, always with 1 sugar, always in the blue and white china that had belonged to the previous owner. "But today was different," she confided, glancing nervously toward Mrs. Pym. "The service was changed at the last minute. Said the usual cup was chipped, though I'd seen no chip that morning." Miss Marple filed this information away with the same care she applied to her stitches. She had noticed the mismatched spoon herself, its tarnished surface standing out against the otherwise pristine tea service. Such attention to detail was characteristic of Mrs. Pym's management style, yet the housekeeper had seemed genuinely surprised when questioned about the substitution. As evening approached and the official formalities were completed, one phrase echoed repeatedly through the conversations. No one had heard anything. Not a cry, not a struggle, not even the sound of a falling teacup until Kitty had entered with the tray. This curious absence of sound became the central puzzle that would occupy the village's collective imagination in the days to come. Dr. Ashe departed with promises to file his report promptly, assuring all concerned that the funeral arrangements could proceed without delay. Yet Miss Marple had observed him washing his hands with unusual thoroughness after his examination, and she wondered what had prompted such careful attention to cleanliness after what appeared to be a perfectly natural death. The manor grew quiet as the last guests departed, leaving only the household staff and Miss Vale, who had accepted Mrs. Pym's invitation to remain for the night. Miss Marple walked slowly home through the damp evening air, her mind already turning over the afternoon's events with methodical precision. Something about the peaceful scene in the study troubled her, though she could not yet put her finger on exactly what it might be. The morning after Mr. Whitworth's death dawned with the peculiar stillness that settles over a village when tragedy has visited unexpectedly. Miss Marple made her customary rounds, her basket over her arm and her mild blue eyes, taking in the subtle changes that grief and speculation had wrought upon St. Mary Mead. At the post office, Mrs. Wheeling dispensed stamps and theories with equal enthusiasm, while the baker's shop hummed with whispered conversations that ceased abruptly whenever a newcomer entered. The official verdict of heart failure had spread through the village with remarkable speed, yet beneath this tidy explanation lay a current of unease that no amount of medical authority could quite dispel. "Such a peaceful end," Mrs. Gribble observed while arranging her morning display, though it does seem strange that no one heard so much as a teacup rattle. This sentiment echoed through every conversation, the curious absence of sound becoming more significant with each retelling. Mrs. Crawford, the sharp-featured handbell ringer, proved particularly vocal in her skepticism. "Mark my words," she confided to anyone who would listen, "there's more to this than meets the eye. I've seen enough sudden deaths in my time, and they're rarely so convenient." Her observations carried weight despite their dramatic delivery, for her seamstress's eye had trained her to notice precisely the sort of details others might overlook. Miss Marple listened to these theories with her characteristic patience, offering gentle nods and occasional murmurs of agreement while filing away each fragment of information. By mid-morning, she had decided that a condolence call at Richwood Manor would be both proper and illuminating. Mrs. Pym received her in the morning room, her usual efficiency barely concealing an underlying tension. The housekeeper's hands moved restlessly as she spoke, straightening cushions that required no adjustment and polishing surfaces that already gleamed. "Miss Vale is resting," she announced with characteristic briskness, though she's bearing up remarkably well under the circumstances. "Such a shock for everyone," Miss Marple murmured sympathetically. "I do hope poor Kitty has recovered from her fright." "The girl will manage," Mrs. Pym replied, though her voice softened slightly. "I've set her to polishing the silver. It helps to keep one's hands busy at such times." Miss Marple's gaze wandered apparently aimlessly around the room, taking in the gleaming brass fittings and the carefully arranged flowers. "You maintain such beautiful standards," she observed. "One notices these things more keenly when visiting. That lovely blue and white tea service, for instance. I remember admiring it yesterday." Mrs. Pym's mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. "Yes, well, we use what's appropriate for the occasion. Though I must say, I was quite puzzled by Kitty's insistence that the usual cup was chipped. I examined the entire service this morning and found no such damage." "How curious," Miss Marple said mildly. Perhaps in her distress she mistook a shadow for a flaw. Young people do tend to see problems where none exist. After taking her leave, Miss Marple encountered Hugh Davenport in the drive. The young estate manager appeared to have aged considerably overnight, his usual confidence replaced by an air of barely controlled anxiety. "Miss Marple," he said, removing his cap with automatic courtesy. "I'm afraid you find us in rather difficult circumstances." "Indeed," she replied gently. "Though I understand from the vicar that Miss Vale will inherit the estate. That should provide some stability during this transition." Davenport's colour deepened. "The solicitor arrives tomorrow to read the will formally. There had been discussions about changes, but nothing was finalized." He glanced toward an upstairs window where a curtain twitched slightly. "Miss Vale has been remarkably composed throughout this ordeal. She's a woman of considerable strength." Miss Marple noted the admiration in his voice and the protective way he positioned himself between her and the house. Young men in love, she reflected, often revealed more than they intended through their very attempts at discretion. Dr. Ash's motor car remained in the drive, suggesting that some additional medical formality required attention. When the doctor emerged from the house, Miss Marple observed that he carried his bag with unusual care and seemed preoccupied with cleaning his hands on a pristine handkerchief. His greeting was cordial but distracted, and he declined her invitation for afternoon tea with the excuse of pressing rounds. As she walked slowly home through the autumn lanes, Miss Marple found herself returning repeatedly to the image of that peaceful study scene. The overturned teacup, the serene expression on the deceased man's face, and most particularly the absolute silence that had accompanied what should have been a moment of distress. In her long experience with human nature, she had learned that the most significant truths often lay hidden in the smallest inconsistencies. The mismatched spoon, the mysteriously chipped cup that showed no damage, the careful positioning of a man who had supposedly died in sudden agony. Each detail added weight to her growing conviction that Mr. Whitworth's death might not have been the natural occurrence it appeared to be. The morning brought Inspector Slack back to Richwood Manor with renewed purpose, his motor car arriving just as the London solicitors departed. Miss Marple, who had been walking past the gates at that precise moment, a coincidence that would have surprised no one who knew her habits, observed the grim satisfaction on the inspector's face as he mounted the front steps. The reading of Mr. Whitworth's will had clearly provided him with exactly the sort of concrete motive that made a policeman's work considerably more straightforward. Mr. Pemberton, the solicitor, had departed with the relieved air of a man who had discharged an unpleasant duty. The will's contents, as these things inevitably do in villages like St. Mary Mead, had already begun their journey through the network of morning calls and chance encounters that served as the local communication system. Miss Clarissa Vale would inherit everything, the manor, the considerable fortune, and all the responsibilities that came with both. It was, by any measure, a substantial motive for murder. Inspector Slack wasted little time in arranging formal interviews with the household. The morning room was transformed into a makeshift interrogation chamber, where each member of the small community that had surrounded Mr. Whitworth would be asked to account for their movements and motives. Miss Marple, ostensibly delivering a jar of her famous marmalade to Mrs. Pym, found herself positioned where she could observe the comings and goings with her characteristic discretion. Miss Vale emerged from her interview with composed dignity, though Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her gloved hands as she adjusted her hat. The young woman had maintained her innocence with admirable consistency, Inspector Slack reported to Dr. Ash, but the facts remained uncomfortably clear. She stood to inherit a fortune, had been present during the crucial period, and possessed both the opportunity and means to have administered whatever had caused her fiancé's remarkably peaceful death. The woman had everything to gain, Slack confided to the doctor, his notebook filled with carefully recorded observations. Motive, opportunity, and no alibi worth speaking of. She admits to handling the tea. Service, earlier in the afternoon, claims she remained with the handbell ringers during the crucial period, but who's to say she didn't slip away unnoticed? Dr. Ash received this information with obvious discomfort, his earlier nervousness having evolved into something approaching distress. When pressed about the medical aspects of the case, he spoke carefully about the unpredictable nature of cardiac events. though Miss Marple observed that he seemed reluctant to meet the inspector's direct gaze. His hands, she noted, bore the telltale redness of someone who had been washing them rather more frequently than necessary. Hugh Davenport's interview proved equally illuminating, though perhaps not in the way Inspector Slack had intended. The young estate manager's obvious devotion to Miss Vale colored every answer he gave, his protective instincts warring visibly with his desire to be helpful to the investigation. He insisted that Miss Vale had remained in full view of multiple witnesses throughout the afternoon, though he admitted that his own attention had been somewhat focused on her welfare during the sudden shower. Mrs. Pym maintained her household's reputation for efficiency, even under official scrutiny, providing Inspector Slack with precise timelines and detailed accounts of every domestic arrangement. Yet Miss Marple detected an underlying tension in the housekeeper's manner, particularly when questioned about the tea service and Kitty's confused account of the supposedly chipped cup. The explanation of hurried preparations and youthful nervousness seemed reasonable enough, but it left certain questions elegantly unanswered. The village's reaction to these developments followed predictable patterns. Mrs. Wheeling at the post office pronounced herself not entirely surprised by the turn of events, while carefully avoiding any direct accusations. The handbell ringers, who had been present during the crucial period, found themselves elevated to the status of key witnesses, a role that Mrs. Crawford, in particular, seemed to relish with characteristic drama. "Mark my words," Mrs. Crawford declared to anyone who would listen, "there's more to this business than meets the eye. That young woman may be guilty of many things, but I doubt murder is among them." This opinion, coming from someone not generally known for charitable judgments, carried unexpected weight among the more thoughtful villagers. Miss Marple listened to these various theories with her customary patience, her knitting needles maintaining their steady rhythm as she processed each fragment of information. The case against Miss Vale was certainly compelling in its straightforward logic, yet something about its very neatness troubled her experienced instincts. In her long observation of human nature, she had learned that genuine guilt rarely presented itself quite so conveniently, while true innocence often appeared far more complicated than the facts might suggest. As she walked slowly home through the autumn lanes, Miss Marple found herself returning to those small inconsistencies that seemed to hover at the edges of the official narrative. The mismatched spoon, the mysterious chip that had left no trace, and most particularly, the absolute silence that had accompanied what should have been a moment of distress. Each detail suggested that the truth lay buried beneath layers of careful misdirection that even Inspector Slack's methodical approach might not penetrate. The obvious suspect, she reflected, was rarely the correct one when the human heart was involved. The following afternoon brought Miss Marple back to Richwood Manor under the perfectly reasonable pretext of retrieving a handkerchief that might have been mislaid during the previous day's confusion. Mrs. Pym received her with the strained courtesy of a woman whose well-ordered household had been disrupted by tragedy and official scrutiny, though she directed Miss Marple to the music room where various forgotten items had been collected. The room held the peculiar stillness that settles over spaces where dramatic events have unfolded nearby. The handbell ringers' instruments remained arranged on their green baize cloth with military precision, each brass bell gleaming despite the grey afternoon light. Miss Marple's gaze wandered over the display with apparent casualness, noting the careful spacing and the small squares of black felt used to dampen the bells when silence was required. It was while examining these arrangements that Kitty appeared with her dustpan, moving with the careful efficiency of someone determined to avoid further trouble. The young parlour-maid's obvious nervousness prompted Miss Marple to settle into a nearby chair, her presence somehow encouraging confidences. "Such beautiful instruments," Miss Marple observed mildly. "I've always admired how they can be made completely silent when necessary. One thinks of silence as simply the absence of sound, but there's considerable skill in creating it deliberately." Kitty's colour deepened as she glanced toward the door. "I never said the cup was chipped," she blurted suddenly, then caught herself with obvious distress. "That is, I did say it, but only because Mrs. Pym told me to use another service, and I thought it better to have a reason. Miss Marple's knitting needles maintained their steady rhythm. You prepared the tea tray as usual? Yes, miss. Mr. Whitworth always took 1 sugar, served at precisely 4 o'clock in the blue and white china. Kitty's voice grew more confident as she recounted familiar routines. But when the shower came on sudden-like, I set the tray here for a moment. My hands were shaking, and I'd rather risk a mark on the baize than broken china on the floor. Miss Marple noted the faint ring on the green cloth, where condensation might have touched the surface. Very sensible. And then Mrs. Pym came in, changed the spoon, said the other wasn't properly polished, and told me to hurry along. Kitty hesitated, then added in a rush, "The cup had a mark on it, miss. Not a chip, but a smudge of colour. Lipstick, I think, though not the usual sort. More mauve than red, and it smelt of violets." This detail sent a small chill through Miss Marple's methodical mind. Miss Vale favoured a bright red shade, while Mrs. Pym's austere standards would never permit such frivolity. Someone else had handled that cup, someone who wore a distinctly different cosmetic and favoured violet scent. After taking her leave of the music room, Miss Marple found herself drawn to glance once more into the study where the tragedy had occurred. The room had been restored to perfect order, the desk polished to gleaming perfection and fitted with a fresh blotter. Yet it was precisely this pristine condition that struck her as most significant. She recalled Kitty's description of finding Mr. Whitworth slumped in his chair, the teacup overturned on the desk blotter. A full cup of hot tea suddenly overturned by a man in distress would have created a substantial spill, one that would have soaked through any blotter, stained the desk surface, and left clear evidence of the accident. Yet when she had glimpsed the scene yesterday, there had been no such dramatic mess, merely the neat outline where liquid had touched the blotter's surface. The implications were startling. If the teacup had contained little or no liquid when it was overturned, then Mr. Whitworth had not died while drinking his afternoon tea. He had died first, silently and peacefully, and the overturned cup had been arranged afterward to suggest a different sequence of events. As she walked slowly through the manor's corridors, Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Crawford, the sharp-featured handbell ringer, emerging from what appeared to be an impromptu visit with Mrs. Pym. The woman carried her sewing basket and wore an expression of barely suppressed satisfaction, as though she had successfully completed some delicate negotiation. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Crawford said, her voice carrying its characteristic edge. "Such dreadful business. Though I must say, the police seem rather hasty in their conclusions. In my experience, the obvious answer is rarely the correct one." The scent of violets hung faintly in the air around her, and Miss Marple noticed that the woman's gloves bore small stains that might have been metal polish. Most tellingly, a corner of black felt protruded from her sewing basket, the sort used to silence handbell clappers when absolute quiet was required. "Indeed," Miss Marple replied with gentle agreement. "One must listen very carefully to what the silence tells us, mustn't one?" The pieces were beginning to form a pattern in her mind, though the complete picture remained frustratingly elusive. That evening brought an unexpected visitor to Miss Marple's cottage in the form of Dr. Ashe, whose usual professional composure had given way to obvious distress. He accepted her offer of tea with hands that trembled slightly, and his careful attention to washing them earlier in the day suddenly took on new significance as she observed his continued agitation. "I find myself in a most uncomfortable position," he confided, settling his cup with unusual care. "Inspector Slack has been pressing me about the medical aspects of Mr. Whitworth's death, and I'm afraid there are details I have not fully disclosed." His voice carried the weight of a man wrestling with professional ethics and personal fear. "The truth is, Miss Marple, I'd been treating Mr. Whitworth for severe insomnia. He requested something to help him sleep, and I prescribed a small quantity of chloral hydrate with very specific instructions about dosage." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused in their rhythm, The implications were immediately clear to anyone familiar with medical matters. Chloral hydrate, while effective as a sedative in proper doses, could prove fatal in larger quantities, particularly when dissolved in hot liquid. More troubling still, it was colorless, tasteless, and would leave little trace in a routine examination. "There's more," Dr. Ashe continued, his professional mask slipping further. "Mr. Whitworth had been pressing me about certain financial arrangements. He had advanced funds when my practice faced difficulties, but recently he'd become quite insistent about repayment. The timing was unfortunate, given my current circumstances." The admission hung between them like a confession, and Miss Marple understood why the doctor had been so nervous during the initial investigation. The following morning brought further revelations when Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Crawford near the church, where the handbell ringers were preparing for their weekly practice. The sharp-featured woman carried her familiar sewing basket, and the scent of violets seemed particularly pronounced in the morning air. "Such a terrible business at the manor," Mrs. Crawford observed, her voice carrying its characteristic edge. "Though I must say, the police seem rather hasty in their conclusions about Miss Vale. In my experience, the obvious suspect is rarely the guilty party." She paused, adjusting the black felt squares in her basket with practiced efficiency. "I was speaking with the vicar yesterday about Mr. Whitworth's promised contribution to the Restoration Fund. A substantial sum it was to be, enough to complete the bell tower repairs we've needed for years." Miss Marple noted the bitterness that crept into the woman's voice. "A disappointment, I imagine, when such promises go unfulfilled." "More than a disappointment," Mrs. Crawford replied sharply, "a betrayal of trust. I had made commitments to the contractors based on his assurances. When he withdrew his support, claiming business difficulties, it left the entire project in jeopardy." Her hands tightened on the basket handle. "I called at the manor yesterday morning to discuss the matter one final time, but he dismissed me quite rudely. Said he had more pressing concerns than village charity." This revelation provided a specific motive that went beyond general resentment. Mrs. Crawford had been personally humiliated and financially compromised by Mr. Whitworth's broken promise, creating exactly the sort of deep, personal grievance that could drive someone to desperate measures. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple made another discovery that would prove crucial to her understanding of the case. While visiting the manor to return a prayer book, she encountered Hugh Davenport in the main corridor, looking troubled and distracted. "Miss Marple," he said, removing his cap with automatic courtesy, "I've been wrestling with something I should have told Inspector Slack. Yesterday afternoon, during the confusion with the rain, I was fetching additional wraps from the linen closet when I saw Mrs. Crawford coming from the direction of Mr. Whitworth's study. She seemed startled to see me and claimed she had lost her way to the powder room, but—" He hesitated, then continued with obvious reluctance. "The study passage leads nowhere else, and she moved with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where she was going." Most significantly, he mentioned noticing that the study's mantel clock, which normally chimed the quarter hours with reliable precision, had been completely silent throughout the afternoon. "Thought it odd at the time," he admitted, "but with everything else happening, it seemed unimportant." Miss Marple filed this information away with growing certainty. A woman with professional knowledge of creating absolute silence, access to the study during the crucial period, a specific grievance against the deceased, and the telltale evidence of violet scent and metal polish. The pattern was becoming unmistakably clear. The silenced clock suggested careful preparation, while the overturned teacup with its minimal spill indicated that death had occurred before the supposed accident was arranged. As she walked slowly home through the gathering dusk, Miss Marple reflected on how the most damning evidence often lay not in what had occurred, but in what had been deliberately prevented from occurring. The chime that should have marked the hour, the cry that should have accompanied distress, and the spill that should have resulted from a dying man's final moments. The morning after her unsettling encounter with Mrs. Crawford brought Miss Marple an unexpected visitor in the form of Inspector Slack, whose usual confidence had given way to obvious frustration. He accepted her offer of tea with the weary air of a man whose investigation had taken an unwelcome turn, and his first words confirmed her suspicions about new complications. "The case has become considerably more complex," he announced, settling his cup with unusual care. "Dr. Ashe came to see me last evening, claiming he's been receiving anonymous threats. Someone, it seems, has been suggesting that his financial difficulties with Mr. Whitworth provide sufficient motive for murder." The inspector's tone carried the irritation of a man whose straightforward case had suddenly sprouted unwelcome complications. "He's quite beside himself, insisting that while he owed the man money, he would never resort to violence." Miss Marple's knitting needles maintained their steady rhythm as she processed this information. Anonymous threats suggested someone was working actively to manipulate the investigation's direction, creating confusion precisely when the evidence was beginning to point toward a specific conclusion. "How very distressing for Dr. Ashe," she murmured sympathetically, "though I imagine such accusations would be particularly troubling for someone in his profession." The inspector nodded grimly. "What's more troubling is that someone has been asking questions about his prescription records at the chemist's shop. Mrs. Hartwell mentioned that a woman called yesterday, claiming to be researching local medical practices for some sort of historical society project. She was particularly interested in sedatives and their proper dosages." He paused, consulting his notebook. "The description matches several village ladies, though Mrs. Hartwell did mention a distinct scent of violets." This detail sent a chill through Miss Marple's methodical mind. Someone was not merely trying to deflect suspicion from themselves, but actively working to build a case against Dr. Ashe. The timing was particularly significant. These inquiries had occurred just as her own investigation was beginning to focus on Mrs. Crawford's involvement. After Inspector Slack's departure, Miss Marple found herself drawn once again to Richwood Manor, where she discovered the household in a state of barely controlled tension. Mrs. Pym received her with strained courtesy, explaining that Miss Vale had finally emerged from her seclusion and was attempting to resume some semblance of normal routine. It was while waiting in the morning room that Miss Marple made a discovery that would prove crucial to her understanding of the case. The room's writing desk bore evidence of recent use. Fresh ink stains on the blotter and several sheets of cream-colored paper scattered about. More significantly, she observed that the desk's small silver inkwell had been recently refilled, though the ink was of an unusual shade, a deep purple that matched exactly the color she had noticed on the anonymous note Inspector Slack had described. The implications were startling. Someone in the household had been conducting correspondence using distinctive purple ink, and the timing suggested this activity was connected to the anonymous accusations against Dr. Ashe. When she mentioned the lovely writing materials to Mrs. Pym, the housekeeper's response was illuminating. "Oh, that would be Mrs. Crawford's doing," Mrs. Pym replied with barely concealed irritation. "She's been using the desk for her church correspondence, something about the Restoration Fund accounts that require immediate attention. I've told her repeatedly that the morning room is for guests, but she insists the light is better for detailed work." Miss Marple noted that Mrs. Crawford had been given unusual access to the manor's facilities, and that her presence in the house provided ample opportunity for the sort of detailed observation that would be necessary to plan and execute Mr. Whitworth's murder. More troubling still was the realization that the woman was now actively working to frame Dr. Ashe, using her knowledge of village gossip and medical practices to build a convincing case against an innocent man. As she walked slowly home through the autumn lanes, Miss Marple reflected on how the pattern was becoming unmistakably clear. A methodical mind that understood both the creation of silence and the strategic deployment of accusations, combined with intimate knowledge of the manor's routines and access to its private spaces. Mrs. Crawford was not merely covering her tracks, but actively reshaping the investigation to serve her purposes. The time was approaching when more direct action would be necessary to prevent an innocent man from bearing the consequences of a carefully orchestrated deception. Miss Marple judged that the moment had arrived for a more deliberate approach to the truth. Under the perfectly reasonable pretext of arranging the memorial service details and discussing the proposed muffled peal for Mr. Whitworth, she invited a carefully selected group to the vicarage for afternoon tea. The gathering would appear entirely natural. Miss Vale came pale but composed. Hugh Davenport accompanied her with protective concern. Mrs. Pym arrived punctually with her customary efficiency. Dr. Ashe attended from parish duty, though he looked increasingly worn by recent events, and Mrs. Crawford accepted with the brisk enthusiasm of someone eager to discuss church matters. The vicarage drawing-room provided the perfect setting, with its comfortable arrangement of hymnals and late chrysanthemums. Most significantly, the mantelpiece displayed the vicar's cherished bracket clock, a handsome piece that marked the quarter hours with reliable precision. Miss Marple poured tea with her characteristic attention to everyone's preferences, noting how Mrs. Crawford's violet scent seemed particularly pronounced in the close quarters of the room. The conversation naturally centered on memorial arrangements, floral tributes, and the bell ringer's proposed tribute. A moment of perfect silence at 4 o'clock would be most fitting, Miss Marple suggested gently, glancing toward the steadily ticking timepiece. Though I confess this dear old clock does make itself heard rather insistently. I should hate for it to interrupt such a solemn moment. Mrs. Crawford's response came with the swift confidence of professional expertise. That presents no difficulty whatsoever, she declared, rising from her chair and crossing to the mantelpiece with practiced assurance. Without hesitation, she opened the small access door on the clock's side and produced a square of black felt from her ever-present sewing basket. With 2 precise movements, she positioned the material between hammer and bell, and the mechanism continued its dutiful motion while the chimes fell completely silent. "One simply needs to know the proper placement," she added, closing the door with a satisfied click. Inspector Slack, who had arrived to discuss seating arrangements and found himself drawn into the gathering, observed this demonstration with sharp interest. The ease with which Mrs. Crawford had accomplished the task, combined with her obvious familiarity with the technique, provided exactly the sort of practical evidence he had been seeking. Dr. Ashe watched with visible relief at the promised quiet, while Miss Vale murmured appropriate thanks. Miss Marple continued serving refreshments, bringing out her treasured blue and white china service. Among the silver, 1 spoon bore the telltale signs of different heritage, slightly more tarnished and of an older pattern. "I do hope you'll forgive the mismatched piece," she apologized with gentle embarrassment. "My Mary is quite particular about Polish, but occasionally things slip past her attention." "Such details hardly matter in informal gatherings," Mrs. Pym replied with characteristic precision, though her glance could have restored luster to silver at considerable distance. "Perhaps not," Mrs. Crawford observed, then added with forced lightness, "unless one were attempting to make a particular point about something." The conversation drifted to recent events, and Miss Marple mentioned with apparent casualness the writing materials on the vicar's desk. The purple ink in the small glass well caught the afternoon light, and she remarked on its distinctive shade. Such an unusual color, it gives such character to correspondence. Mrs. Crawford's fingers, which had been steady while handling her teacup, showed the slightest tremor as she adjusted a piece of notepaper that bore faint purple smudges. A small crescent of matching color had transferred to her glove where it had brushed against the inkwell's edge. "One must exercise care with such strong pigments," she observed. "They leave traces on everything they touch." "Indeed they do," Miss Marple agreed thoughtfully. "Rather like those unpleasant anonymous letters that have been troubling our community. Inspector Slack mentioned they were written in just such a distinctive shade." The atmosphere in the room shifted subtly, as though everyone had simultaneously drawn breath and forgotten to release it. Mrs. Crawford's hand rose unconsciously toward her throat, and the gesture carried with it the faint but unmistakable scent of violets that had become her signature. At that moment, young Tom from the constabulary appeared at the door with a message for Inspector Slack. The note, when read, brought a grim satisfaction to the inspector's features. "From the solicitor," he announced to the gathered company. "They've discovered a draft letter among Mr. Whitworth's papers, a carbon copy of correspondence to the vicar, dated the very morning of the garden party. It expresses serious concern about discrepancies in the Church Restoration Fund accounts and requests a private meeting to discuss the matter." The silence that followed was profound. Mrs. Crawford's carefully maintained composure wavered visibly as she processed the implications of this discovery. Her sharp features arranged themselves into an expression of surprised dismay, but the reaction came a fraction too late to appear entirely natural. "How extraordinary," she managed. "The vicar never received any such communication." "The draft suggests it was never sent," Inspector Slack replied, his gaze steady, but the intention was clearly there. Miss Marple's knitting needles maintained their gentle rhythm as she observed the small drama unfolding before her. The pieces were falling into place with satisfying precision. The expertise with silencing mechanisms, the distinctive ink and scent, the financial motive, and now the concrete evidence of Mr. Whitworth's suspicions about the fund. The psychological test had succeeded beyond her expectations, revealing not only Mrs. Crawford's capabilities, but also her increasingly desperate attempts to maintain her facade of innocence. The time had come for the final revelation, though Miss Marple knew it must be approached with the delicate precision that such moments demanded. Miss Marple set down her teacup with the deliberate care of someone who had reached a moment of absolute certainty. The silence that followed Inspector Slack's revelation about Mr. Whitworth's draft letter seemed to press against the vicarage walls, broken only by the muffled ticking of the silenced clock, a sound that had become, she realized, the key to everything. "I'm afraid," she began in her gentle voice, "that we have been witness to a most carefully orchestrated deception. The death of Mr. Whitworth was neither the natural occurrence it appeared to be, nor was it committed by any of the obvious suspects who have drawn our attention." Her mild blue eyes settled on Mrs. Crawford, whose sharp features had grown increasingly pale. "It was, instead, the calculated act of someone who understood precisely how to create the perfect silence necessary for murder." The scent of violets seemed to intensify in the close quarters of the room as Mrs. Crawford's hands tightened on her sewing basket. "Miss Marple, surely you cannot be suggesting—" "I am suggesting exactly what the evidence has been telling us from the beginning," Miss Marple interrupted with uncharacteristic firmness. "You have just demonstrated the precise skill required to silence a timepiece without stopping its mechanism. The same expertise that quiets a handbell was used to ensure that the mantel clock in Mr. Whitworth's study would not chime during the crucial period of his death." She gestured toward the purple ink stains on Mrs. Crawford's gloves. "The anonymous letters accusing Dr. Ashe were written in that distinctive shade, the same ink we observed on the Manor's writing desk, where Mrs. Pym confirmed you had been working on church correspondence. You are not merely covering your tracks, Mrs. Crawford, but actively attempting to frame an innocent man." Dr. Ashe leaned forward with obvious distress. "But my prescription of chloral hydrate? How could anyone have obtained sufficient quantity to "The Church Restoration Fund," Miss Marple explained with quiet certainty, "provided both the means and the motive. As treasurer, you had access to funds that could purchase medical supplies from multiple sources without arousing suspicion. More importantly, Mr. Whitworth's threatened audit would have exposed whatever irregularities existed in those accounts." Mrs. Crawford's composure began to crack visibly. "This is all speculation. You have no proof." "The proof lies in the details you thought too insignificant to matter," Miss Marple continued relentlessly. "Young Kitty observed a trace of mauve lipstick on the teacup, not Miss Vale's bright red, but your distinctive shade, scented with violets. The overturned cup spilled remarkably little liquid, suggesting death had occurred before the scene was arranged. Most tellingly, you replaced the original spoon with an older, tarnished piece after using it to stir the fatal dose into Mr. Whitworth's tea." Inspector Slack consulted his notebook with growing excitement. "The timing fits perfectly. You visited the manor that morning, ostensibly about the restoration fund, but actually to make your final preparations. When the shower began, and Mr. Whitworth retired to his study, you followed. Miss Marple nodded approvingly. You silenced the clock to prevent any witness from marking the precise time, then administered the chloral hydrate. The sedative would have caused peaceful unconsciousness followed by death. No struggle, no outcry, nothing to disturb the garden party's tranquil atmosphere. When Kitty arrived with her tray, she found a man who appeared to have simply dozed off. The facade that Mrs. Crawford had maintained so carefully throughout the investigation finally shattered completely. Her voice, when it came, was raw with desperation and years of accumulated resentment. "He promised!" she cried, her sharp features contorting with rage. "He led me to make commitments to the contractors, to stake my reputation on his word, and then he withdrew his support without a thought for the consequences. He would have ruined everything, the restoration, my position in the community, my entire life's work." The confession hung in the air like the lingering scent of violets, confirming what Miss Marple's methodical observation had already revealed. Inspector Slack moved forward with his handcuffs, his expression mixing satisfaction with professional regret. As Mrs. Crawford was led away, her once proud posture now stooped with the weight of exposure, Miss Marple reflected on how the most carefully planned crimes often contained within them the seeds of their own revelation. The very silence that had made the murder possible had also made it detectable to anyone who understood that in human affairs, the absence of expected sound could be more significant than any amount of noise. The vicarage drawing-room returned to its natural quiet, though the atmosphere now carried the heavy satisfaction of truth finally revealed. The departure from the vicarage carried with it the weight of revelation finally released. Inspector Slack's motor car disappeared down the lane with Mrs. Crawford seated rigidly beside him, her violet scent lingering like an accusation in the autumn air. The remaining guests dispersed with the peculiar quiet that follows the shattering of long-held illusions, each carrying away fragments of truth that would reshape their understanding of their quiet community forever. Miss Vale leaned heavily on Hugh Davenport's offered arm, her composure finally cracking to reveal the profound relief beneath. Dr. Ashe walked with the measured steps of a man reprieved from a nightmare he had not fully comprehended until its ending. Mrs. Pym departed with characteristic efficiency, though her usual briskness carried undertones of someone whose orderly world had been fundamentally disturbed by the revelation that evil could operate so methodically within familiar routines. News of Mrs. Crawford's arrest spread through St. Mary Mead with the inexorable efficiency of village communication. The post office became a hub of whispered conversations, where Mrs. Wheeling dispensed theories alongside stamps, and the baker's shop hummed with retrospective wisdom. "I always said there was something about that violet scent," became a common refrain, though few had expressed such suspicions before the truth emerged. The inquest, held in the parish hall's panelled room, proceeded with measured gravity. Evidence was presented about tea services and silenced clocks, about the precise timing of afternoon showers and the deadly properties of chloral hydrate administered with professional precision. Kitty testified with pale determination about the mauve lipstick trace and the mysteriously substituted spoon, while Dr. Ashe explained the medical aspects with visible relief at being witness rather than suspect. The jury's verdict of murder against Mrs. Crawford surprised no one, though the trial that followed would provide weeks of dramatic testimony. Her defense relied heavily on claims of financial desperation and temporary insanity, but the methodical nature of her crime, the silenced clock, the prepared alibi, the attempt to frame Dr. Ashe, spoke to calculated malice rather than momentary madness. The manor underwent significant transformation in the aftermath of tragedy. Miss Vale, now sole proprietor of Richwood and its considerable fortune, proved surprisingly capable of managing both estate matters and the complex emotions surrounding her inheritance. Her engagement to Hugh Davenport was announced within the month, a development that surprised no one who had observed their mutual devotion during the investigation's darkest moments. Dr. Ashe recovered his professional equilibrium gradually, though he remained more cautious about extending credit to patients in financial difficulty. The anonymous accusations had shaken him profoundly, and he spoke with genuine gratitude about Miss Marple's intervention. "I still cannot comprehend how she expected to succeed with such elaborate deception," he confided during one of their chance encounters. Mrs. Pym maintained her position as housekeeper with renewed efficiency, though she instituted stricter protocols regarding household access and visitor supervision. The blue and white tea service returned to daily use, while the tarnished spoon disappeared permanently into the back of a drawer, a small reminder of how easily familiar objects could become instruments of deception. The Church Restoration Fund, after careful audit, revealed the full extent of Mrs. Crawford's desperate manipulations. Miss Vale honored Mr. Whitworth's original pledge, ensuring the bell tower repairs could proceed properly. When the new bells were finally installed, their clear, unmuted tones seemed to emphasize the importance of transparency in all community affairs. As winter settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple often reflected on the case during her evening walks through familiar lanes. The investigation had demonstrated how the most sophisticated crimes often contained the very elements that ensured their detection. Mrs. Crawford's expertise with creating silence had made murder possible, but it had also provided the crucial clue that revealed her guilt. Most significantly, the case had reinforced Miss Marple's long-held conviction that human nature, however carefully concealed behind respectable facades, remained fundamentally readable to those who observed with sufficient patience and understanding. The small inconsistencies, a mismatched spoon, a minimal tea spill, the telltale scent of violets, had accumulated into an irrefutable pattern of guilt. The village would heal, as villages always do, but it would carry forever the knowledge that darkness could lurk beneath the most proper surfaces. Trust, once freely given, would now be measured more carefully. Yet life would continue, and Miss Marple would remain ever observant, ready to untangle the next web of secrets that human hearts seem so determined to weave. In the end, she reflected, it was always the silence that spoke loudest. Not the absence of sound, but the deliberate creation of it for purposes that honest hearts would never require. The departure from the vicarage carried with it the weight of revelation, finally released. Inspector Slack's motor car disappeared down the lane with Mrs. Crawford seated rigidly beside him, her violet scent lingering like an accusation in the autumn air. The remaining guests dispersed with the peculiar quiet that follows the shattering of long-held illusions, each carrying away fragments of truth that would reshape their understanding of their quiet community forever. Miss Vale leaned heavily on Hugh Davenport's offered arm, her composure finally cracking to reveal the profound relief beneath. Dr. Ashe walked with the measured steps of a man reprieved from a nightmare, while Mrs. Pym departed with characteristic efficiency, though her usual briskness carried undertones of someone whose orderly world had been fundamentally disturbed. The trial of Mrs. Crawford concluded on a grey February morning with a verdict that surprised no one familiar with the methodical nature of her crime. Her defense of temporary insanity crumbled against evidence of careful planning. The silenced clock, the prepared alibis, the deliberate attempt to frame Dr. Ashe. Justice, though measured, found its mark with appropriate severity. The manor underwent significant transformation in tragedy's aftermath. Miss Vale, now Mrs. Davenport following her swift engagement to Hugh, proved surprisingly capable of managing both estate matters and the complex emotions surrounding her inheritance. Their happiness, though founded on tragedy's ashes, promised genuine renewal rooted in mutual devotion and shared purpose. Dr. Ashe recovered his professional equilibrium gradually, instituting stricter protocols regarding prescription medications while expressing profound gratitude for Miss Marple's intervention. Mrs. Pym maintained her position with renewed efficiency, though she later confessed her role in the spoon substitution. "I changed it myself," she admitted to Miss Marple during a subsequent visit. The tray had been tampered with, violet scent on the cup that had no business being there. I fetched a clean spoon from the scullery, an old tarnished piece from the jumble box, meaning to replace it properly, but forgot in the confusion. News of Mrs. Crawford's conviction spread through St. Mary Mead with characteristic village efficiency. The post office became a hub of whispered conversations, where retrospective wisdom flourished. "I always said there was something about that violet scent," became a common refrain, though few had expressed such suspicions before truth emerged. The Church Restoration Fund, after careful audit, revealed the full extent of Mrs. Crawford's desperate manipulations. Miss Vale honored Mr. Whitworth's original pledge, ensuring the bell tower repairs proceeded properly. When new bells were finally installed, their clear, unmuted tones seemed to emphasize the importance of transparency in all community affairs. The handbell ringers reorganized under new leadership, their practice sessions resuming with careful attention to both musical precision and proper instrument handling. The replacement treasurer proved to be a retired bank manager whose meticulous record-keeping would have impressed even Mrs. Crawford, though his approach lacked her fatal combination of expertise and desperation. As spring settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple often reflected on the case during her evening walks through familiar lanes. The investigation had demonstrated how the most sophisticated crimes often contained the very elements ensuring their detection. Mrs. Crawford's expertise with creating silence had made murder possible, but it had also provided the crucial clue revealing her guilt. Most significantly, the case reinforced Miss Marple's fundamental understanding of human nature. That guilt, however carefully concealed, inevitably revealed itself through accumulating inconsistencies that patient observation could detect. The silenced clock, the mismatched spoon, the minimal tea spill, and the telltale violet scent had combined to create a pattern as clear as any fingerprint to those who understood proper interpretation. The village would heal, as villages always do, but it would carry forever the knowledge that darkness could lurk beneath the most proper surfaces. Trust, once freely given, would now be measured more carefully. Yet life would continue, and Miss Marple would remain ever observant, ready to untangle the next web of secrets that human hearts seemed so determined to weave. The restored bells of St. Mary Mead now marked the hours with renewed clarity, their voices carrying across the village with reassuring regularity. In the end, she reflected, it was always the silence that spoke loudest. Not the absence of sound, but the deliberate creation of it for purposes that honest hearts would never require.